Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest edition of conversations around onshore wind and the resurgence of onshore wind in the UK. The UK Westminster government has decided that it's going to reopen onshore wind, potentially in England in particular. Of course, onshore wind projects have continued in Scotland over the intervening period, but we're now seeing a renewed vigour to deploy onshore wind, particularly to reach the net zero targets. And of course, Wales itself has been developing onshore wind projects, and those continue to come forward. I'm delighted to be joined in this conversation with Amy McPherson and Ross Howells, both who are stationed up in our Edinburgh office. Hello to both of you.
Hi.
And let's kick off with the first question, I guess, which is part of the reason for doing these conversations is because since the first big wave of onshore wind that we're all involved in, things have moved on. A lot of the developers may have departed the market. We've got new developers coming in, new funders, new acquiring entities of those projects. So there's a changed landscape here, both in terms of the projects themselves, but also all of the parties involved. And we thought it would be a good idea to give them the benefit, if you like, of our knowledge about what's been going on onshore wind and where things have got to. From the construction and supply chain perspective, how would you say the market has moved since the early days of onshore wind?
That's a good question, Ross. I think we're seeing quite a lot of shifts on the technology side. So when they first started being developed, they're about 60, 70 meters. And now turbines are much, much larger. So 140 meters is quite common, and planning has been approved for around 180 meters in terms of heights of turbines. And that in itself brings a lot of challenges, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a moment. The other thing that we're seeing a lot of is co-location with batteries. So battery sites and battery projects generally have been in parallel increasing. And now we're seeing co-location with turbines by about 20% mid-2023 to mid-2024. So you're going to see a lot more turbine and batteries at the same time. And then, as you say, we've had this lift of the banning and a target of doubling our onshore wind capacity by 2030. So we're expecting that market to get even busier over the next 10 or so years.
And I suppose in terms of that, the market will have evolved, the contracts will have evolved, people will have got used to it, the supply chain would have evolved as well. You mentioned batteries there. I guess we could add hydrogen into that, couldn't we, Ross, as well? Because whilst battery storage is the obvious add-on to some of these sites, increasingly we're seeing green hydrogen projects as well being considered. So I think from a construction perspective, it ought to be a proven market, proven technology. People will have developed their contracts. We know the supply chain. But I know from what you've told me in all sorts of other sectors that at the moment there's a constrained supply chain market. So I suppose what are the challenges that developers will now face in building these projects out? Even though it's a proven technology, they're going to face some challenges, aren't they?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. So I think, obviously, with the constrained supply chain, there's going to be an increased need to kind of secure long lead items, secure those key components. So something that we've been seeing and advising our clients to do is kind of enter into these pre-construction services agreements. So when you're negotiating your TSA or turbine supply agreement, you'll enter into a kind of pre-contract with the contractors to give them a mandate to go away and order any long lead items or any other key components. I think another thing that is really important for developers to consider is obviously it's going to be a kind of contractors market, or already is a contractors market. So I think developers ensuring that they're going and presenting their projects to contractors kind of as ready as possible, making sure that they're kind of there's going to be no hurdles along the kind of development and construction of these products, so that they can secure the right contractors for them and their projects.
That is a change, isn't it? Because I remember the days when the supply chain was there and was looking at ways in which it could deploy its technology. Now what you seem to be saying there, Amy and Ross, is actually the developers have got to go and almost sell their project to the supply chain, which is a bit of a changing dynamic, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly that. We've had it where we're negotiating on the other side, against supply chain, and they're just busy. Their books are so busy, and they're filled with projects that are perhaps slightly more developed, and it sometimes means you don't get the attention that a developer would typically expect in a project. And things like, where are you on that grid connection queue, which is that's very much in your neck of the woods, Ross. That's the kind of thing that they think, oh well, they're more important because they're the ones that are closer to the finishing line. So we're having those discussions at the moment.
And are we getting a sense from those supply chain businesses and companies that they're being much more robust and possibly retrenching in terms of what they're prepared to offer in terms of conditions and contracts and things like that?
Yeah, definitely. We've seen that with especially in the kind of BOP contractor market, because obviously the BOP contractors don't necessarily work just in kind of onshore wind. They'll work across battery, they'll work across hydrogen, they'll work across offshore wind as well. So they're increasingly very busy. And then another thing that we've seen kind of recently is, despite the market being really busy, there's actually been quite a lot of kind of BOP contractor insolvencies as well. So that kind of adds another complexity and consideration for developers.
I'll come on to that in a minute, because it would be interesting to know where, taking aside Bob, but where the turbines are coming from as well, and the constraints around that. But I guess on those terms and conditions, a developer therefore is going to have to take a view. They may not get what they traditionally thought they might have got years and years ago, and many of those developers, if they're still in the market, will have evolved with the construction supply chain, so that should be okay. But I suppose some of the funders and some of the corporates looking at buying these projects that are ready with the construction contracts in place are going to have to be realistic about the terms that are now applicable from that supply chain, and in a sense they need to understand that gone are the heady days of the project developers dictating what they want, or the funders dictating what they want.
That's exactly right, Ross. I think a really good example of that is just things like the types of bonds we're seeing. So there's a lot of pushback on, immediate on-demand bonds. If you've got, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later, but if you've got a supply chain that's a Chinese-backed entity, that there's quite nuances about what the Chinese government and the Chinese-backed government is able to give in those bonds. And another one's collateral warranties, for example. That's quite simple, but as soon as you start looking outside of the UK, European and Asian entities aren't aware of what they are or how they are. Typically, we would be able to convince them to enter into one, and more so we're getting pushback, and they just say, well, tough, speak to your funder and see if you can get by without having a collateral warranty in favour of anyone. And there are ways we can do that, but those are conversations we would never really have to have had until recently.
And I think another kind of important thing for developers, and we might touch on this later, but to kind of it's important that you kind of engage funders early, because although it's a known technology and funders know kind of they've seen TSAs, turbine supply agreements and LTSAs, and they're kind of obviously willing to put up the money to fund these, but because it is a contractor market, and it's more than likely, and what we've been seeing is it's contractor forms of contracts that they're bringing to the table, and engaging a funder early, kind of understanding what a funder's red lines are, what they consider kind of bankable, will be really important. Okay.
Can I move on then to just the turbines, I suppose, because the turbine manufacturers, there's still a limited number of them, and increasingly, of course, we're looking at Asia, China, various others for those manufacturers. Is that where the turbines and the future turbines are going to come from? And then I suppose if you're looking outside of Europe and the more traditional turbines that people have got used to over the years from Denmark, various other places, what challenges does it pose in terms of some of those nascent turbine markets?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting. We will continue to see the kind of European turbine suppliers that we saw in the kind of original boom, and that have been continuing to provide turbines in Scotland and Wales kind of over the last few years. But I think that they are kind of coming, or we're seeing a rise in China exporting, or Chinese companies exporting turbines, and I think that will continue. So it'll be the likes of kind of Goldwind owned a majority stake in Vensis, which is a kind of German headquartered company will see kind of envision. And I think that generally, as well as being kind of turbine suppliers, China also manufactures a lot of the components as well. So it's something like 3/5 of the world's nacelles are manufactured in China. I think kind of they are a lot cheaper. So it's maybe a more attractive option for developers going forward. But in kind of terms of key or like issues that kind of developers might face, I guess, is kind of large transportation costs. I guess also in terms of there might be kind of embargoes on certain countries going forward, which might present a lot of issues.
The other thing we're also seeing is the ESG aspect of it. So it's key topic in all of the renewable sectors, but when you have such a supply chain which is far spread across the world and in China especially or Asia generally, it becomes more in the spotlight. So you want to make sure that things like your modest slavery, your sustainable materials being used, and there is a sort of evidenced pathway of origin for all these components. And that's something that we're seeing as standard being requested in the contract. Yeah, and
it's definitely a really key and hot topic for funders. That's something that they really want to encourage and see in contracts.
Yeah, it's not unique to Asia or China, is it? It's across the board. But I suppose the cautions are there to double check that with the funders and various other. Okay, look, thanks very much, both. That's really useful. Perhaps to end on. Have you got any further hot tips, I suppose, for developers thinking about this when it comes to the supply chain and construction for this new wave of onshore wind that we're promised? I know you've mentioned a few, but are there any others you just want to throw into the mix quickly to finish with?
Yeah, I think the key one is that early engagement with contractors and your supply chain. So just making sure that you have got and you can secure kind of early orders of any key components and long lead items. So that kind of reduces the risk of kind of increase of prices or also your exposure to kind of volatility of pricing.
The other thing to add to that, I think, is as we discussed at the beginning of this, we're expecting an increase in the demand and the increase in building out of these onshore wind farms because of the policy changes that we're seeing. So you won't be the only developer who's had this idea.
Yes.
So there's going to be everyone and their dog trying to build one of these. So keep that in mind. And so we've talked about, looking downwards into the supply chain. Likewise, look upwards, where are your funders coming from? They will have the pick of the best in terms of which projects to fund. So make sure your business case is solid. Make sure, because you've got early engagement with, things like the grid, you've got, a feasible connection time. And all of those things as a package will make you more attractive than the project next to you that's also going to be looking for funding.
Yeah, and I suppose it's a fair point to mention, isn't it? It's a good point to pick up on because we're in a global market as well. So when we look at the growth in the UK and onshore wind, there's also onshore wind developments all around the world that people will be vying for and the supply chain will be looking to. So why are the ones in the UK attractive? What makes your project attractive to the supply chain? Look, thanks both of you. Thanks, Amy. Thank you, Ross. Really useful. That concludes this one. We've got more conversations on our website and also on our social media channels. If you want to pick up on this conversation, then by all means contact any of us three here and go onto our website if you want to download this or find out more about this particular presentation. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ross.